The heat is the first thing you lose, and the last thing you remember. In the cell, the cold is absolute, a physical weight that sits on your chest and presses the air from your lungs. But back then, in the manufactorum, the heat was a living thing. It tasted of recycled sweat and oil that had been boiled and condensed 1,000 times over. I remember the way my uniform stuck to my back, a second skin of grime that never really dried. I remember the weight of the cog tag around my neck. It was cheap metal stamped with a number that mattered more than my name, Worker 771 Delta. It used to tap against my sternum with every motion of the press, a constant rhythmic reminder of who I was. A worker, a component, a thing that functioned. I miss that sound. I miss the certainty of being a number. You don't think about the noise until it stops. Sector Delta was a cathedral of grinding metal, a symphony of pistons and steam vents that drowned out every thought in your head. That was the mercy of it. You didn't have to think. You just moved. Lever forward, piston down, lever back, vent steam, repeat. The rhythm was a prayer, and we were the monks of industry chanting with our bodies. I had done it for 10 years. My father had done it until his heart burst. It was a good life because it was a simple one. But that day, the rhythm felt wrong. It wasn't the machine. The press was functioning within standard tolerances. The wrongness was inside my skull. It started as a pressure behind the eyes, like a sinus headache that wouldn't drain. But it wasn't fluid. It was static. Have you ever stood too close to a high-power voxcaster when it's searching for a signal, that high-pitched whine that sits right at the edge of your hearing, making your teeth ache? It was that, but it was louder, and it was coming from the inside. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was dehydration. I told myself it was the stim shots they put in the water supply to keep us awake for the double shifts. I drank from my canteen, but the water tasted like ash. The static didn't stop. It got sharper. It started to sound like voices. I looked at the worker next to me. His name was Harl. We had worked side by side for 3 years, but we had never spoken about anything other than the quota. He was looking at his machine, his eyes glazed with the same dull focus we all had. But then for a second I heard him. I didn't hear his voice. I heard his fear. It washed over me like a bucket of ice water. He was afraid he wasn't going to make the quota. He was afraid of the foreman's whip. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't intuition. It was a scream echoing in my own head, distinct and terrified. I dropped the lever. The press slammed down out of rhythm, a jarring clang that made heads turn. Keep the pace. 771. The voice came from the gantry above. The foreman. He was a small man, made large by the power of the shock maul at his belt. His voice usually made me flinch, made me double my efforts. But this time his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from the other end of a long tunnel. The only thing that felt close was the static. The whispers were scratching at the back of my throat now. They weren't speaking High Gothic. They weren't speaking anything human. They were just sounds of hunger, wet and eager. I gripped the controls of the press until my knuckles turned white. I just wanted it to stop. I closed my eyes and pushed the thought away, trying to shove the noise back into the dark corner of my mind where it belonged. That was my mistake. You can't push back against something that has no substance. When I pushed something in the air, changed. The temperature dropped. Not the ambient heat of the factory that was still stifling, but a sudden localized pocket of freezing cold right around my station. Frost white and impossible bloomed on the hot metal of the control lever. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The laws of physics, the laws of the machine god said that shouldn't happen. Metal that is 300 degrees does not freeze. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. The machine started to whine. It wasn't the mechanical grind of gears stripping. It was a high-pitched keen like a wounded animal. The pressure gauge on the central boiler didn't just climb. The needle snapped all the way to the red and bent against the limiter pin. I panicked. I slammed the emergency vent release. Nothing happened. The valve was stuck, fused by the impossible cold. The whining grew louder, climbing in pitch, until it harmonized with the screaming in my head. I could feel Harl staring at me. I could feel the foreman running along the gantry. But they were slow. Everything was moving through molasses. "Stop it," I whispered. The words didn't make a sound in the roar of the factory, but I felt them leave my lips. Just stop. The whispers laughed. They liked the fear. They fed on it. The smell hit me then. It wasn't the oil or the sweat anymore. It was ozone. Sharp electric chemical. The smell of a thunderstorm trapped in a bottle. It tasted like copper on my tongue. The air around me began to ripple like heat haze, but dark. I looked at the pressure gauge. I didn't touch it. I just wanted it to go down. I begged it to go down, and it obeyed. The needle didn't just drop. The glass face of the gauge shattered outward. The bolts holding the primary steam pipe didn't loosen. They sheared off as if cut by an invisible blade. The explosion wasn't a fireball. It was a release of pressure so violent it felt like a solid punch to the chest. I was thrown backward, my boots losing traction on the slick floor. I hit the grating hard, the breath driven out of me. Steam, scalding and white, filled the air, blinding me. But I didn't feel the heat. I was freezing. I was shivering so hard my teeth clattered together. I lay there in the fog, gasping for air that tasted of wet metal and that damned ozone. The factory alarm was blaring a low, mournful hoot that signaled a catastrophic failure, but it sounded muffled like I was underwater. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't work. I looked down at my chest. My cog tag was floating. It wasn't resting on my tunic. It was hovering 3 inches in the air, defying gravity, trembling with the same vibration that was shaking my bones. I reached up to grab it, to pull it down, to hide it. The steam began to clear, sucked away by the ventilation fans. I saw the machine, my press. It was twisted. The thick iron frame was bent inward, imploded, rather than exploded, as if a giant hand had crushed a soda can. Harl was gone. I didn't look for him. I knew with that same sickening new sense that he wasn't there anymore. The silence that followed was worse than the alarms. The other machines had stopped. The other workers were backing away, forming a wide, empty circle around me. They weren't looking at the damage. They were looking at me. I saw the look in their eyes. I had seen it before, when we found a rat in the ration supplies, or when someone showed signs of the coughing plague. It was revulsion. It was terror. They knew. They didn't know the word Psyker. We weren't allowed to know that word, but they knew I was wrong. They knew I was a curse. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them I was still 771. I was still the man who shared his recaf. I was still the man who helped Harl fix his jammed loader. But the words stuck in my throat. The ozone smell was so strong now it was making me gag. The foreman didn't come down. The foreman was a bully, but he wasn't stupid. He was already on the Voxcaster screaming for the enforcers. I stayed on the floor. I didn't try to run. Where would I go? The manufactorum was a fortress. The city outside was a labyrinth. And the thing that had destroyed the machine, it was inside me. You can't run from your own blood. I just sat there, gripping my floating cog tag, forcing it down against my chest until the metal bit into my skin. I needed to feel the pain. I needed to feel something real. The enforcers didn't run. They marched. I heard their boots on the gantry stairs, a heavy, synchronized thud, thud, thud that shook the floor plates. They wore full carapace armor, black and scarred, and their faces were hidden behind rebreather masks that made them look like insects. They didn't shout commands. They didn't ask what happened. They carried shock mauls, active and crackling with blue energy. They parted the crowd of workers without touching them. Men scrambled over each other just to get out of their path. The lead enforcer stopped 5 feet from me. He didn't look at the twisted machine. He looked at a scanner in his hand. The device was clicking madly, a sound like a Geiger counter screaming in agony. He looked at me. I saw my reflection in the black lenses of his mask. I looked small. I looked broken. I looked guilty. Citizen, his voice was synthesized, stripped of all humanity by the Vox grill. Designation 1 Delta. It was an accident, I whispered. The valve stuck. Silence. He didn't strike me. He didn't need to. He raised a heavy black pistol, not a las pistol. Something larger, something that fired a web. He pulled the trigger. A net of weighted cords wrapped around me, tightening, instantly pinning my arms to my sides. The impact knocked me over. Then came the boot. It came down on the back of my head, driving my face into the oily floor grating. I tasted grease and blood. "Bag him," the voice said. Standard containment. Do not touch his skin. Rough hands and thick insulated gloves grabbed me. They hauled me up like a sack of grain. A hood, thick and smelling of chemical disinfectant, was shoved over my head. The world went black. The last thing I saw was my COG tag glinting on the floor, where it had been ripped from my neck. It lay in a puddle of oil looking like a dead star. I was 7-1 no longer. I was just a thing to be processed. The darkness was absolute, but the whispers were finally laughing. The war would continue, it always did. There is a cold that makes you shiver, and then there is a cold that makes you stop. The cell was the second kind. I woke up not because I was rested, but because the shivering had become a convulsion that slammed my bones against the floor. I was naked. The oil and grime from the manufactorum had been scoured away, likely with high-pressure hoses and chemical solvents that left my skin raw and stinging. I couldn't see my hands in front of my face. The darkness was heavy, tangible, like a blanket of black wool wrapped tight around my head. But I knew I was moving. The floor beneath me was vibrating, a deep subsonic thrum that rattled my teeth. It wasn't the rhythmic pounding of a factory piston. It was a constant, powerful drone. Engines. Massive engines. I was on a ship. I tried to sit up, but the movement made me retch. My stomach was empty, so nothing came up but bile, hot and acidic in the freezing air. I huddled in the corner, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to preserve whatever warmth my body still held. I waited for the whispers. I waited for the static scratching behind my eyes, the voices that had destroyed my life, the chaotic noise of the warp that I had learned to hate. I waited for them to tell me where I was, to taunt me, to scream. But they didn't come. There was nothing. And that was when the real fear started. You might think silence is a blessing. I thought so too. I used to lie in my bunk in the workers' hab, praying to the God Emperor for just 1 minute of quiet. But this wasn't quiet. This was an amputation. It felt as if a limb had been hacked off, leaving a phantom ache where my mind used to touch the world. The space inside my head where the whispers usually lived was a gaping wound. I reached out with my mind, a reflex now, like checking for a pulse, and I found only a wall of gray, suffocating nothingness. It made me feel small. It made me feel like a candle that had just been blown out. A sound cut through the dark. Click. Hiss. It was mechanical, precise, and terrifyingly close. A heavy lock tumbled. A door I hadn't seen slid open with the grind of metal on metal. Light flooded in, not the warm yellow of a lumen strip, but a harsh blue-white glare that stabbed my eyes. I threw my hands up to shield my face, squinting through my fingers. A figure stood in the doorway. It was human-shaped, but it felt wrong. It felt like a hole in reality. Just looking at it made my vision blur and my stomach turn over. My instincts screamed at me to run, to claw through the back wall, to do anything to get away from the thing standing there. She stepped into the cell. She was clad in gold and burnished steel armor that looked more like a reliquary than a uniform. A high topknot of white hair spilled from a helmet that had no face, just a smooth, blank grill. She didn't speak. She didn't breathe. She just existed, and her existence was an offense to my soul. She was a null maiden, a sister of silence. I didn't know the title then, of course. I only knew that when she got closer, the emptiness in my head expanded into agony. It felt like she was drinking the air from the room, drinking the heat from my blood, drinking the very spark of life out of me. I backed away until my spine hit the freezing metal wall. "What are you?" I croaked. My voice was a wreck, dry and trembling. She didn't answer. She didn't acknowledge my question. To her, I wasn't a person. I was a dangerous isotope that needed to be shielded. I was a leaky reactor. She raised a hand, and I flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, she pointed a device at me. A Vox bead at her collar clicked again. Click. Hiss. Unit 44 Gamma. A synthesized voice spoke from her armor. It wasn't her voice. It was a machine spirit translating her intent, flat and dead. Vital signs stabilized. Psi index dormant. Null field effective. She stepped closer. The aura of wrongness intensified. It was like standing next to a reactor core with the shielding stripped away, but instead of radiation, it was a vacuum. I felt tears freezing on my cheeks, not from sadness, from biological revulsion. My body wanted to die rather than be near her. "Please," I whispered. The voices, they're gone. I'm cured. You can let me go. The blank faceplate stared at me. The silence is not a cure, the machine voice said. It is a cage. She moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible in that heavy armor. Before I could blink, she had gripped my arm. Her gauntlet was cold, colder than the air. She jammed a pneumatic injector against my neck. There was a sharp hiss of compressed air and a sting that went deep into the muscle. "Sedate for transit," the voice said. The room began to spin. The blue light smeared into streaks. The vibration of the floor seemed to travel up my legs and liquefy my bones. I slumped against the wall, sliding down until I hit the floor. The Sister of Silence turned and walked out. The door slid shut, sealing me back in the dark, as the drug pulled me under. The silence remained. It was absolute. It was heavy. I realized then what had happened. I had prayed to the Emperor for the whispers to stop. I had begged for peace. Now, drifting into a chemically induced coma in the belly of a black ship, I realized the Emperor had answered my prayer. He had given me silence, but he hadn't given me peace. He had given me the silence of the grave. I didn't move. The darkness ate me. Time died in the dark. I don't know if we were in the warp for weeks or months. The only way to measure the passing of hours was the rhythmic cycle of the air scrubbers and the periodic hiss of the feeding nozzles. When I woke from the sedation, the silence of the cell was gone, replaced by a sound that was infinitely worse. It was the sound of breathing. Not one person, or 10, but thousands. I was no longer in a solitary box. I was in a cavernous cargo hold, a vast, hollowed-out ribcage of the ship packed so tight with bodies that I couldn't stretch my legs without kicking the stranger curled up beside me. The smell hit me before the noise did. It was a physical wall of stench, urine, unwashed skin, infected wounds, and the copper tang of fear sweat. It was the smell of cattle waiting for the hammer. We were stacked on metal shelves, row upon row, climbing up into the gloom where the ceiling should have been. There were no lights, only the dim red emergency lumens that flickered like dying embers. I looked at the people around me. Some were weeping silently. Some were rocking back and forth, muttering prayers to a god who had clearly sold them to this place. Others just stared at nothing, their minds already broken by the realization of what they were. We were the tithe. We were the currency the Imperium used to pay its debts to the dark. The Sisters of Silence didn't come into the hold. They didn't need to. Their presence was a distant, cold pressure on the hull, keeping the nightmares of the warp at bay. But in here, amongst ourselves, the psychic dampening was weaker. That was my torment. My curse, the thing that had made the machine explode, was that I could feel too much. I was a receiver with the gain turned all the way up. In the manufactorum, I had felt Harl's anxiety. Here, I felt the terror of 5,000 souls. It washed over me in waves of nausea. I could feel the girl 3 rows down who was dreaming of her mother. I could feel the old man next to me, whose heart was fluttering like a trapped bird, skipping beats failing. I tried to close my eyes to shut it out, but you can't close your mind. The mental noise was a cacophony of screaming, begging, and bargaining. It was a choir of the damned. I realized then that I had to make a choice. I could let the empathy drown me, let their fear become my fear, until I went mad, or I could kill that part of myself. I looked at the old man. He was shivering. He reached out a hand, his fingers grasping at my tunic, looking for comfort, for a human connection in the dark. I felt his desperation. It was cold and sticky. I didn't take his hand. I pulled away. I turned my back to him and pressed my forehead against the cold metal of the shelving. I imagined a wall. I imagined laying bricks of gray stone one by one, sealing myself inside a tower where their feelings couldn't touch me. It was cruel. It was necessary. I heard him wheeze a wet, rattling sound. Then I heard him stop. I didn't turn around to check. I just added another brick to the wall. Feeding time was the only interruption. Panels in the walls would slide open, and pressurized hoses would spray a gray, flavorless nutrient paste into troughs. It wasn't food. It was fuel. It tasted like wet cardboard and chemical suppressants. At first, people fought for it. They clawed and bit, driven by animal instinct. But after the first few cycles, the fighting stopped. We didn't have the energy. We just shuffled forward, scooped the sludge into our hands, and ate in silence. I saw a woman drop her portion. She fell to her knees and licked it off the floor, uncaring of the filth. I didn't look away. I didn't feel pity. I just guarded my own portion. The wall in my mind was getting higher. Bodies began to pile up. The old man next to me wasn't the only one. The weak died quietly in their sleep. The mad died screaming until the automated servitors came to drag them away. The servitors were lobotomized cyborgs, heavy and mindless, moving with a clanking efficiency. They would grab a corpse by the ankle and haul it down the central aisle. We learned to move our legs out of the way. We learned not to look at the faces of the dead. If you looked, you might recognize someone. If you recognized someone, the wall might crack. I lost track of who I was. 71 Delta was a memory. The man who had friends who drank recaf, who had a father, he was gone. I was just a biological component waiting for installation. I spent the cycles counting the rivets in the ceiling plate above me. 144 rivets. I counted them until the numbers lost meaning. I focused on the vibration of the engines, the deep thrum that traveled through the metal and into my spine. It was the only constant. It was the heartbeat of the beast that had swallowed us. Then the rhythm changed. The constant thrust of the engines cut out, replaced by the jarring retrograde fire of braking thrusters. The gravity shifted, throwing us all to the side. The entire ship groaned a sound like a planet cracking open. Massive docking clamps slammed home with a thud that shook the dust from the rafters. The red emergency lights turned off, replaced by blinding white floodlights that snapped on, instantly searing our eyes. We had stopped. The journey was over. A hiss of hydraulics announced the opening of the massive cargo doors. Cold, recycled air rushed in, carrying the scent of incense and ancient stone. We weren't home. We were on Terra, the cradle of humanity, the throne world. I should have felt awe. I should have felt joy at reaching the holy soil. But as I looked at the thousands of emaciated, filth-caked wretches around me blinking in the harsh light, I didn't feel holy. I felt like livestock arriving at the slaughterhouse. The silence stayed. It wasn't mercy. The air of holy Terra didn't taste like holiness. It tasted of dust, ancient stone, and the exhaust of a billion engines. As we stumbled down the ramp of the black ship, blinded by the floodlights, the atmosphere hit us like a physical weight. It was thick with incense, heavy cloying clouds of frankincense, and myrrh pumped from gargoyle-headed vents to mask the smell of the unwashed masses. We were herded into a processing cathedral that defied logic. The ceiling was so high, it was lost in a haze of candle smoke, and the walls were lined with statues of saints that looked down on us with stone faces of judgment. I felt insignificant, not just small, but microscopic. A single grain of sand on a beach that stretched for eternity. "Remove raiment," the voice boomed. It wasn't a person. It was the building itself speaking through massive vox casters hidden in the architecture. Discard all personal effects. Contraband is heresy. We obeyed. There was no hesitation. The journey had beaten the resistance out of us. I pulled off my tunic, the one that still smelled faintly of the manufacturum oil. I dropped it onto a pile that was already a mountain of rags. Boots, belts, lockets, prayers, everything that made us individuals was stripped away and fed into the incinerator chutes. I stood naked in the cold air, shivering, surrounded by thousands of others who were just as pale and thin as I was. I looked at my hands. They were the only things I owned now. Procession, evaluation, sanitization. We were pushed through high-pressure chemical showers that burned our eyes and scoured our skin raw. Then came the shears. Servitors with rusty buzzing clippers grabbed us by the necks, shaving our heads to the scalp in seconds. I watched locks of hair fall to the wet floor, mixing with the gray water. I used to be proud of my hair. It was black and thick like my father's. Now it was just biomass clogging the drain. I reached up to touch my bare skull. It felt alien. It felt like an eggshell, fragile and exposed. Then came the branding. We were forced to kneel before a row of Otto Quill's brass machines with needle-tipped arms that hummed with menacing heat. I didn't struggle when the clamp locked my head in place. I stared straight ahead at the gold-plated skull mounted on the wall. Zzzzt. The laser burned into the skin of my neck right below the ear. The smell of cooking flesh mixed with the incense, creating a sickly sweet perfume that made me gag. I didn't scream. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. The needle retracted, leaving a throbbing, searing mark. I wasn't Kale anymore. I wasn't 71 Delta. The machine had written a new truth in my flesh. Initiate 881 Kalen. I stood up, swaying slightly. A drill abbot, a man with a face like tanned leather and a bionic eye that whirred as it focused, walked down the line. He stopped in front of me. He didn't look at my eyes. He looked at the fresh burn on my neck. "You are no one," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You are a vessel. If you are empty, the Emperor may fill you. If you are full of yourself, you will be broken." He moved on. I looked at the man next to me. He had the same brand, the same shaved head, the same hollow look. We were identical. We were bricks in a wall, indistinguishable from one another. They marched us to the cells. These weren't the containment cages of the black ship. These were stone cells, cold and austere, designed for monks, not prisoners. But the lock on the door was heavy iron. I sat on the narrow cot. The stone walls seemed to press in. They told us we were on holy Terra, the center of the galaxy, the place every human soul yearns to see. But as the door slammed shut, plunging me into shadow, it didn't feel like a pilgrimage. It felt like I had walked into the open mouth of a beast that was slowly, methodically beginning to chew. The silence stayed. It wasn't mercy. The training room was a void of white tiles and stainless steel. There were no shadows here, only the harsh, uncompromising glare of lumen strips that hummed with a frequency that made my teeth ache. I stood at a metal table, my wrist locked into a heavy brass gauntlet. Wires trailed from the device, disappearing into the floor like the roots of a mechanical tree. This was the neural cuff. They didn't call it a torture device. They called it a corrective learning tool. On the table, sitting in a small depression, was a simple gray river stone. It looked harmless. It was the heaviest thing I had ever tried to move. "Begin," the instructor said. He stood behind a pane of reinforced armor-glass, his voice piped in through the vox. He was a sanctioned Psyker himself, an old man with skin like parchment and eyes that looked like they had seen the heat death of the universe. "Reach out. Do not use your hands. Use the warp, but filter it. Be the dam, not the river." I closed my eyes. I tried to find the feeling I had in the manufactorum. I remembered the panic. I remembered the fear of the foreman. I let the emotion swell in my chest, a hot, desperate ball of energy. I pushed it at the stone. I wanted it to fly. I wanted to smash the glass. Snap! The world turned white. The neural cuff didn't burn my skin. It fired a jolt of pure agony directly into my nerve endings. It felt like my arm was being dipped in boiling lead. I screamed my back, arching my knees, slamming into the table legs. The pain was absolute. It erased thought. It erased time. "Wrong," the voice said. It was bored. Emotion is weakness. Emotion is the crack where the demons get in. You are using fear. Fear is fuel for the enemy. Try again. I hung over the table, gasping, sweat dripping from my nose onto the white steel. My arm was twitching uncontrollably. I hated him. I hated the stone. I hated the Emperor. Snap. Another jolt, shorter but sharper. "I can taste your hate, Woodle." Kylan. Hate is also a weakness. Clear your mind. Be the stone. Be the cold. I forced my breathing to slow. In holdout. I imagined the cold cell. I imagined the silence of the Null Maiden. I built the wall in my mind, brick by gray brick, shutting out the pain, the hate, the fear. I found a quiet place in the dark. And in that dark, I found a thread. It smelled of ozone. It hummed with power. But it wasn't a scream this time. It was a low, steady note. I didn't grab it. I guided it. I let the energy flow through me, cold and precise, like water through a pipe. I looked at the stone. I didn't want it to move. I willed it to exist 3 inches higher. The smell of ozone spiked, sharp and electric. The hairs on my arm stood up. The stone didn't tremble. It didn't shake. It simply ceased to be on the table and began to be in the air. It hovered, rotating slowly, defying the gravity that held me down. For a second, the pain was gone. The fear was gone. There was only a rush of pure, intoxicating power. I felt like a god. I felt like I could crush the table, the room, the world. "Hold," the instructor ordered. "Maintain." I held it. The stone spun. I could feel its texture with my mind, the roughness of the grain, the coldness of the rock. It was intimate. It was part of me. "Cease." I let the thread go. The stone clattered back onto the metal table. The ozone faded, leaving the stale smell of recycled air. I slumped against the table, exhausted, my arm aching where the cuff had bitten me. "Adequate," the voice said. The locks on the cuff clicked open. "You have taken the first step. You have learned that pain is the price of failure." I rubbed my wrist. I looked at the stone. I had moved it. I had touched the power of the warp, and I hadn't exploded. I hadn't summoned a demon. I had won. But as I walked back to my cell, the triumph faded into a cold dread. I had controlled the power, yes. But in doing so, I had proven I was useful. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a weapon being calibrated. I had done it. I had controlled the power. I didn't realize I was just forging the first link in my own chain. The room wasn't empty. It felt full, like a lung held before an exhale. They called it the reflection chamber, but there were no mirrors on the walls. Just black metal that seemed to absorb the light from our eyes, drinking in the faint illumination until the darkness felt heavy enough to crush us. I stood in the center, shivering, though the air was stagnant and warm. Initiate 8082 was 10 paces to my left. I could hear his breathing ragged, shallow gasps that hitched in his throat. He was terrified. I wanted to tell him to stop to build his wall, but I couldn't speak. The darkness was already moving. It swirled around my ankles like dry ice fog, cold and seeking. It didn't start with a demon. The warp knows you. It knows what makes you small. The shadows coalesced, twisting like oil on water, until they formed a shape I knew too well. The foreman. He wasn't human-sized. He was a giant looming over me with that shock maul raised high, the electricity arcing between the flanges, with a sound like tearing canvas. I could smell the grease on his uniform. I could hear the crack of the leather. "You broken cog," the phantom voice sneered. It sounded like grinding gears. "You ruined the line. You are waste." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I flinched, raising my arms to protect my face. I was back in the factory. I was small again. I was Sidam, Mamorthel-1, and I was about to be punished. "Banish it." The instructor's voice cut through the illusion, cold and metallic over the hidden vox beads. "It is a lie. Burn it, 8281, or it will banish you." I froze. The maul was descending. It looked solid. If I believed it, it would kill me. That was the test. If my mind accepted the blow, my body would die. I lowered my arms. I didn't look at the maul. I looked at the face. I remembered the ozone. I remembered the power that had snapped the steam pipe. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt cold indignation. "You are not real," I thought. "I am real." I pushed. I didn't lift a stone this time. I imagined a fire. Not a hot red fire that gives comfort, but a cold white flame that consumes everything it touches. I projected it outward, a spear of mental will aimed right at the foreman's chest. The phantom shrieked a sound like tearing metal and dissolved into wisps of gray smoke. The maul vanished inches from my skull. The smell of ozone flooded my nose, sharp and victorious. I stood alone in the dark chest, heaving sweat cooling on my skin. I had won. I had killed the ghost. Then I heard the scream. It wasn't a phantom. It was wet and human. I turned to look at Initiate 882. He hadn't fought. He was on his knees, clawing at his own eyes, screaming about spiders, about teeth in the dark. The shadows around him weren't dissolving. They were thickening. They wrapped around him like a cocoon of liquid tar pulsing with a life of their own. He reached out a hand toward me, his fingers hooked like claws. "Help me," he gurgled. "It's eating. It's—" I didn't help him. I didn't move. I stayed in my circle of safety watching. The instructor's voice returned devoid of pity. "Unit 8082. Failed." The floor beneath the screaming boy opened up. He fell into the blackness below his cries, cut off instantly by the slam of the trapdoor. The room was silent again. I stood there, the smell of ozone fading into the smell of fear sweat. I had banished the shadow. But as I turned, I saw the empty space where he had been. I never saw 882 again. They marched us up the spire of 1,000 steps. My legs burned, but the pain was distant, muted by the drugs and the conditioning. The air grew thin cold and violently charged. Every hair on my body stood on end. We entered the apex chamber, a vast domed cathedral where the shadows were long and the air tasted of copper and ancient dust. In the center stood a throne. It wasn't the golden throne. No mortal could look upon that and live. But it was a relay, a conduit, a lightning rod built of gold and bone and singing circuitry designed to catch the overflow of the Emperor's psychic roar. They strapped us into the brass pews arranged in concentric circles around the device. The restraints were engraved with hexagrammatic wards that bit into my skin. I looked to my left. A girl no older than 20 was weeping silently. I looked to my right. A man was muttering the Lectitio Divinitatis so fast the words blurred into a single desperate hum. I didn't pray. I didn't weep. I stared at the throne. I could feel the power radiating from it, a heat that didn't burn the skin but blistered the soul. The head instructor stepped onto the dais. He wore robes of crimson and gold, and his eyes were sewn shut. He didn't need them here. In Nomine Imperator, he chanted his voice, amplified by the acoustics of the dome, until it sounded like the voice of the mountain itself. Anima tua, obligatum est. Your soul is bound. The machine behind him groaned. The heavy cables snaking across the floor began to pulse with light. I felt a pressure build in my skull, the same pressure from the manufactorum, but multiplied by 1,000. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a shout. It was a command. The barriers in my mind, the walls I had built were smashed aside like paper. Then the light hit me. It wasn't a light you see with your eyes. It was a light that exploded inside your brain. It was a sun igniting in the center of my consciousness. It burned. God, Emperor, how it burned. It didn't burn like fire. It burned like truth. It scoured every corner of my mind, illuminating every secret, every fear, every selfish thought I had ever held. There was no hiding. I was naked before the Astronomicon. I felt my individuality stripping away layer by layer. The worker, the initiate, the man. All of it was fuel for the fire. I screamed. I heard thousands of others screaming with me, a chorus of agony that echoed across time. We were being welded to the Emperor. We were being forged. The pain was the hammer, and the light was the anvil. I felt the bad parts of me, the uncontrolled empathy, the wildness, the chaos being cauterized. It was surgery without anesthetic on the soul. I tried to hold on to something, anything. I thought of my father. Burned. I thought of the smell of recaf. Burned. I thought of my name. Burned, and then silence. The screaming stopped. The light faded to a dull golden embers in the back of my mind. I slumped in the restraints, smoke rising from my skin. The pain was gone. The fear was gone. I felt clean. I felt hollowed out, scraped empty, and then filled with something cold and hard and eternal. I opened my eyes. The world looked sharper. The colors were muted, but the edges were razor thin. I looked at the girl next to me. She was slumped forward, drooling, her mind shattered. She hadn't survived the forging. I unbuckled the restraints. My hands were steady. I stood up. I felt the connection now, a silver thread tying me to the throne, tying me to him. I was no longer a wild thing. I was a tool. I was sanctioned. I tried to think of home. I tried to remember the face of the woman who gave birth to me. I reached for the memory, but there was nothing there. Just gray static and the smell of ozone. I had touched the Emperor's light, and it had burned me clean. When I opened my eyes, I could no longer remember my mother's face. They didn't give us time to recover. The soul binding leaves you raw like skin that has been scrubbed with wire wool, but the Imperium does not wait for convalescence. We were herded from the golden light of the apex chamber, down into the bowels of the complex to the armory. The air here was different. It didn't smell of incense or ozone. It smelled of gun oil, polished leather, and the stale sweat of logistics. This was where the spiritual ended and the mechanical began. I stood in front of a mirror for the first time in months. I didn't recognize the man staring back. He was gaunt, his cheekbones pressing against skin that had turned the color of old parchment. His head was shaven, shining under the harsh lumen strips. But it was the eyes that stopped me. They used to be brown. Now they were flecked with silver like cracked glass. And below the ear, the burn scar had been inked over. A new tattoo, black and sharp, the Imperial Aquila, and beneath it the designation Sanctioned Extremis. It wasn't a rank. It was a warning label. It told the world that I was dangerous, but that I had been checked, tested, and leashed. Next, the quartermaster barked. He was a mortal, a heavy-set man with grease under his fingernails. He sat behind a wire mesh cage, surrounded by racks of laser guns and flak armor. I stepped forward. He looked up, saw the tattoo, and the color drained from his face. He didn't look at me with the contempt the drill abbots had. He looked at me with pure animal revulsion. He leaned back in his chair, putting as much distance between us as the small booth allowed. Designation, he asked, not meeting my eyes. 881 Kalen, I said. My voice sounded different too. Deeper. Hollow. Battle Psyker assignment. Cadian 412th attachment. He stood up and began placing items on the counter. He moved quickly, as if touching the objects I would soon hold might infect him. A flak jacket standard issue green, a last pistol sidearm pattern, a comms bead, and finally the staff. It was a force staff, a rod of black iron topped with a crystalline matrix in the shape of a winged skull. He slid it across the metal counter. He didn't hand it to me. He pushed it with the end of a stylus, careful not to let his skin graze mine. Sign, he said, pushing a data slate forward. I reached for the slate. My fingers brushed his hand. He flinched violently, snatching his hand back, as if I were red-hot iron. He wiped his hand on his trousers again and again. I am not a plague, I said softly. Just take the kit witch, he muttered, staring at the floor. And get out. I picked up the staff. As soon as my skin touched the metal, I felt it. It hummed. It wasn't a sound. It was a vibration that traveled up my arm and settled in the base of my skull. It felt like a tuning fork that was perfectly matched to the frequency of my own blood. It was a focuser, a lightning rod. It whispered to the power inside me, promising release. I dressed in the corner. The flak armor was stiff and uncomfortable. The boots were heavy. I holstered the last pistol, though I knew I would likely never fire it. My weapon was the staff. My weapon was the headache behind my eyes. The instructor walked in as I was fastening the clasps of my gorget. He looked at me, nodding once. You are graded Primaris level, he said. Too volatile for the astropathic choirs. Too dangerous for the administrative librarius. You are a blunt instrument 881. You are for the front. I am ready to serve, I recited. The words were automatic. Serve well, he said. But remember, the commissar assigned to you will have a bolt pistol. He will watch the enemy, but he will watch you closer. Do not give him a reason. I walked out of the armory, the metal tips of my boots clicking on the stone floor. The staff hummed in my grip. I passed a squad of guardsmen in the corridor. They stopped talking as I approached. They pressed themselves against the walls, making a wide path for me. I saw a young soldier make the sign of the Aquila over his chest, warding off evil. They gave me a weapon and a uniform. They called me a sanctioned Psyker. But I knew what I really was. I was a bomb they were pointing at someone else. The ramp of the transport shuttle awaited. The shuttle ramp dropped with a hydraulic scream, revealing a world of gray sludge and gray sky. It was raining. Not the cleansing rain of an agri world, but a thick, oily drizzle that tasted of promethium and rot. I stepped out into the mud. It sucked at my boots immediately, a hungry, wet sound that would become the soundtrack of my life for the next 6 months. The forward operating base was a sprawling wound in the earth, a maze of trenches and prefab bunkers reinforced with sandbags and prayer strips. Thousands of men and women moved through the gloom, shouting, carrying crates, cleaning weapons. But as I walked down the ramp, the staff humming in my hand, the activity around me ceased. It was the ripple effect again. Silence radiated from me like a contagion. I was attached to the Cadian 412th, shock troops, veterans. They were men who had stared down orcs and heretics without blinking, but they wouldn't look me in the eye. As I walked through the assembly area, I felt their gazes sliding off me. A sergeant was drilling his squad near a Chimera transport. He saw me approach, his eyes narrowing. Eyes front, he barked, his voice cracking with sudden tension. "He's specialist attached. Ignore him." They didn't ignore me. They stiffened. I saw a young trooper make the sign of the Aquila over his chest, warding off evil. I heard the whispers, the superstitious curses muttered under breath. Witch boy. Freak. Spook. I kept my face impassive, hiding behind the mask of the sanctioning, but inside the old, Kale felt a pang of longing. I just wanted to stand by a fire and warm my hands. But I knew that if I approached a fire, they would let it go out rather than share the warmth with me. Then I met my shadow. He was waiting for me at the command bunker. Commissar Holt. He was a statue carved from granite and hatred wrapped in a long black greatcoat that seemed impervious to the mud. He watched me approach with eyes that were calculating, assessing not a soldier, but a piece of faulty equipment. He didn't salute. He didn't offer his hand. He rested his gloved palm on the grip of his bolt pistol. It was a heavy, brutal weapon, uncased and ready. The message was clear before he even spoke. "Your power is a tool, 881, he said. His voice was low, barely audible over the rain, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, smelling of recaf and gun oil. "My bolt pistol is also a tool. See that I only have need of yours." I looked at the pistol. I knew the doctrine, the mercy of the Emperor. If I lost control, if the warp took me, his job was to put a bolt shell through my brain before I could become a doorway for something worse. He wasn't my commander. He was my executioner waiting for an excuse. "Understood, Lord Commissar," I said. My voice was flat. He didn't nod. He just tapped the Vox bead in his ear. Click. A burst of static echoed in my own earpiece. He had a direct line. He would be listening to every breath I took. He turned and walked away, the wet leather of his coat snapping in the wind. I stood alone in the rain, the water dripping from my nose, soaking into my collar. I was surrounded by the safety of the Imperial Guard, thousands of lasguns between me and the enemy. But as I looked at the commissars retreating back, I realized the truth. The only person watching me closer than the enemy was the commissar standing right behind me. The city was a skeleton. It had been dead for weeks, picked clean by artillery fire, until only the ribs of ferrocrete buildings remained stabbing up into the gray sky. We moved through the rubble in silence, a column of ghosts in wet fatigues. The silence was heavy, pressurized. It was the kind of quiet that screams at you to turn back. I could feel them before I saw them. A dull, throbbing headache at the base of my skull, not the sharp static of the warp, but the muddy, brutish psychic echo of a mob, a hunger, a green tide. The Cadians knew it too. Their instincts were honed on 100 worlds. They checked their power packs. They tightened their grips. But they didn't look at me. They looked at the shadows. The ambush broke the silence like a hammer hitting glass. A roar, guttural and wet, erupted from the ruins to our left. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated in the gut. Then came the solid slugs, crude bullets the size of fingers chewing through the masonry. The squad scrambled for cover. I saw a trooper, a boy named Jace, who had shared his ration bar with me, once turned to run. His head vanished in a pink mist. He dropped without a sound. The sergeant was screaming orders, but they were lost in the thunder of bolters and the crude chugging of Xenos shooters. We were pinned. The enemy was closing a green wall of muscle and violence, pouring over the debris. Which? The sergeant's voice cut through the chaos. He was huddled behind a crumbling pillar, his face bloodied. He wasn't looking at the enemy. He was looking at me, his eyes wide with desperation. That building, the flank, bring it down, blockade them. I looked at the commissar. He was crouching behind a slab of rock, his bolt pistol drawn. He didn't look at the enemy. He looked at me. He nodded once. A permission to kill. A permission to be the monster. I stood up. I shouldn't have. The air was filled with lead, but I didn't feel the fear anymore. I felt the staff in my hand. It was vibrating so hard it numbed my fingers. I reached into the dark place in my mind, past the wall, past the silence. I grabbed the thread of power. It wasn't a thread today. It was a cable thick and pulsing with the ambient violence of the battlefield. I didn't filter it. I drank it. The smell of ozone exploded in my nose, drowning out the smell of cordite and blood. I pointed the staff at the ruined manufactorum looming over the charging orcs. Push. It wasn't a word I spoke. It was a kinetic slam of pure will. I felt the resistance of the stone, the structural integrity of the steel beams. And then I felt them snap. The sensation was intoxicating. It was a rush of endorphins that made the manufactorum explosion look like a spark. I roared a sound that wasn't entirely my own, and the building obeyed. It didn't fall. It was thrown. Tons of rock and steel buckled and collapsed, crashing down onto the street with the force of a meteor. The Xeno's scream was cut short, buried under a mountain of dust and rubble. For a moment, I didn't stop. The power was singing in my blood. I saw a straggler, a massive beast pulling itself from the debris. I didn't need the staff. I just looked at it. I focused my will into a lance of white fire. Burn. A bolt of lightning arced from my eyes, or maybe my mind, and struck the creature. It didn't just die. It detonated. Wet chunks of alien meat rained down on the street. It was easy. It was joyful. I felt like a god walking amongst insects. I wanted to do it again. I wanted to tear the whole city down. Sufficient when we hunted one day not one. The commissar's voice crackled in my ear, sharp and cold. Conserve. The order hit me like a splash of ice water. The joy vanished, replaced instantly by a crushing exhaustion. My knees buckled. I leaned heavily on my staff, gasping for air that tasted of copper and dust. The ozone smell faded, leaving the sickness of the warp in my stomach. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, but from withdrawal. I had touched the sun, and now I was cold again. The dust settled. The shooting had stopped. The squad began to emerge from cover, their weapons raised, checking the bodies. I looked for the sergeant. He was standing 10 feet away, dusting off his flak armor. He looked at the crushed building. Then, he looked at the smoking crater where the straggler had been. Finally, he turned his eyes to me. I expected gratitude. I expected a nod. I had saved them. I had crushed the ambush. But there was no thanks in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a soldier who had done his duty. He was looking at a loaded weapon that had just gone off too close to his face. He took a step back. His hand hovered near his combat knife. Clear the sector, he muttered to his men, his voice shaking. Stay away from the asset. I stood alone in the ruin I had made. I had saved the squad. I had killed the enemy. And as I lowered my staff panting, I realized the truth of my existence. They didn't hate me because I was weak. They hated me because I was strong in a way they could never understand. The sergeant's terror was purer than any fear he had shown the orcs. To him, the orcs were just an enemy to be fought. I was a horror to be endured. The silence after the battle rang in my ears. War is not glory. It is endurance. It is a contest to see which machine breaks first, the tank tracks grinding in the mud or the mind of the soldier lying in it. We had been in the trenches for 6 weeks. The mud had become a part of us, a cold, wet second skin that smelled of excrement and dead things. I hadn't slept in 3 days. Sleep was dangerous. In sleep, the wall in my mind crumbled. In sleep, the dreams came scratching at the door I had locked so tight. I stayed awake on stims, and fear clutching my staff like a lifeline. My eyes felt like they were filled with sand. My skin felt thin as if the air itself was scraping against my nerves. Target designated. The commissar's voice was a rusted file in my ear. Bunker complex. Grid 4 Alpha. Clear it. OE1. I looked at the bunker. It was a slab of ferrocrete sitting low in the fog, spitting heavy bolter fire that pinned the platoon down. I nodded. I didn't have the energy to speak. I stood up, the mud sucking at my boots. I raised the staff. It felt heavy today. Everything felt heavy. I reached for the power for the ozone thread, but it was slippery. My mind was exhausted. I grasped at the warp, and I pulled too hard. I didn't just open a channel. I tore a hole. It wasn't the clean, cold power of the Emperor's light. It was something else. It was thick and oily. It tasted like copper and spoiled meat. A voice whispered in my ear, not a memory, not a thought, but a real voice right there, intimate and wet. "Let go," it said. Just let go. For a fraction of a second, a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, I wanted to. I wanted to stop fighting. I wanted to sleep. I let the barrier drop. The world screamed. The mud around my boots didn't just splash, it boiled. Frost, black and jagged, raced across the ground, shattering the stones. The air temperature plunged 40 degrees in a second. The heavy bolter fire from the bunker stopped, not because I had crushed it, but because the gunners inside were suddenly screaming. Shadows that had no source lengthened and twisted, grasping at the ankles of the Cadian soldiers. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat, a laugh that wasn't mine. I felt a smile stretching my face that I hadn't ordered. The thing in the dark was here. It was looking through my eyes. Clack. Click. The sound of a bolt pistol hammer being drawn back was the loudest thing in the universe. It cut through the laughter. It cut through the madness. I froze. The commissar was 5 feet away. He wasn't looking at the bunker. He was looking at me. The barrel of his pistol was leveled directly at my forehead. His finger was tightening on the trigger. There was no hate in his eyes, only duty. He was going to kill me. He was going to end the threat. "Recite," he roared, his voice cutting through the psychic screaming. The litany of binding now. The fear of the bullet was sharper than the seduction of the warp. I gasped, choking on the bile in my throat. I forced my jaw to move. I am the anchor? I screamed the words, spitting saliva. My soul is the wall. His will. His will protects. I slammed the mental door shut. It took everything I had. It felt like closing a blast door against a tidal wave. I fell to my knees, retching. The black frost evaporated. The shadow snapped back to normal. The laughter died, leaving a ringing silence in the air. The bunker was silent. Whatever I had let through, it had touched the men inside. They weren't shooting anymore. I looked up, wiping the vomit from my chin. The commissar was still standing there. The pistol was still leveled at my head. He stared at me for a long, agonizing minute, waiting to see if the monster would blink again. "Bunker cleared," he said into the Vox, his voice flat. "Move up." He lowered the weapon, but he didn't reholster it. He kept it in his hand, his thumb on the safety for the rest of the day. He never walked in front of me again. The dawn broke gray, filtering through the smoke of the burning city. The shelling had stopped. The silence of the aftermath was heavy, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the clinking of mess tins. I sat on a crate of ammunition, a rag in my hand, cleaning my staff. It was a ritual. Rub the metal, polish the crystal, check the seals. It was the same motion I used to use to clean the press in the manufactorum. Back then, I hummed while I worked. Now, I worked in silence. A new soldier, a reinforcement from the dropships, walked past. He saw me and froze. He nudged the veteran next to him. "Is that him?" he whispered. The witch, the veteran, didn't look at me. He just spat on the ground. "Quiet, rookie. He's on our side. Mostly." They walked on, giving me a wide berth. I didn't look up. I didn't care. Their fear didn't hurt me anymore. It was just data. It was just noise. I looked at the tattoo on my arm. The ink had faded slightly under the grime, but the number was still clear. 801K. I tried to summon the memory of the man who used to be 771 Delta. I tried to remember how it felt to be afraid of the dark, to be afraid of the foreman, to want a family. It was like trying to remember a dream from 10 years ago. The edges were blurry. The emotions were dull. That man was dead. He had died in the cell on the black ship. He had died in the light of the Astronomicon. I stood up. My joints clicked. I felt old, though I was only 25. The staff hummed in my hand, a hungry, familiar vibration. The ozone smell was faint, lingering in my clothes like stale perfume. I checked my comms beat. Unit 881, the commissar's voice crackled. "We are moving out. Sector 7. "Acknowledged," I said. I used to fear the whispers in my head. I used to fear the silence. I used to pray for peace. Now I fear nothing. I am the Emperor's will made manifest, and the Emperor is cold. The Emperor is distant. The Emperor is a weapon, and so am I. The sun was rising. Another day, another battle. I survived. But as I walked into the gray mist following the men who hated me, I often wonder, did Kyle